And now we can begin. So welcome everybody. My name is Mary Bear Shannon. I work in the reference department at the Haverford Township Free Library. And I am really excited to have Jim Segrave-Daly here tonight to talk about Washington's crossing of the Delaware. And is it 10 days, Jim, that you're going to
crucial 10 days.
The crucial 10 days. So just a little bit about Jim, if you're not familiar with him. So Jim, I know Jim from when we both served on the board of the Haverford Township Adult School. And we were thinking about curriculum, and we said, we should have some more history classes. And Jim says, well, I have a history degree. I'll teach some classes on history. And a star was born. And Jim has been teaching for the Haverford Township Adult School and actually has 2 classes this spring. The catalog was just made available in the last week. So you can go to the Haverford Township Adult School website and look at their catalog. One is on the age of invention or inventions over the course of history, US history and World War I. So if you get your appetite whet for Jim's teaching style and his enthusiasm for history, going over to the adult school to sign up for those classes. Jim has done programs for us on Zoom, in person. We did one over at Niter Hall this last summer in coordination and in partnership with the Haverford Township Historical Society. And I hope we'll do more of those this year when it becomes a little warmer. And the other thing that Jim and I were just talking about before you came on is that he is now sitting on an education committee for the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the US. And the Delaware County celebration of and what is the name of 250? I know there's a special name, and
it's simple. It's called PA 250.
Okay, but isn't, like there's a bicentennial? What's 250? Do you know?
Oh, sesquicentennial.
Sesquicentennial. Okay. Yes. There's just not enough room up here.
No, I think that's wrong. Sesqui is 125. See, Mary, you're supposed to send me these questions beforehand so I don't look foolish.
Sorry about that.
Whoever wants to Google that and get extra credit tonight.
I can tell you, Mary, it's the semi-quincentennial.
Semi-quincentennial.
Semi is half, quin is 500.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
quincentennial.
Now we know.
Star for Kathy.
There you go.
Thank you, Kathy.
I work down in the historic area.
So Jim is working on that committee to figure out, to talk about how we're going to celebrate here in the county, and also about what kind of books we might read. And the library would hopefully will be involved with any kind of book discussion about our history, especially here in Delaware County, which is super interesting. So anyway, without further ado, Jim, welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. And thanks to everybody for showing up tonight. Greatly appreciate it. One bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, interrupt me. I'm from a large family. I'm used to it. Otherwise, I will just keep going and going and going. But no, I will take times throughout the talk to ask if there are questions. Feel free, if you don't want to verbalize them, to type them in the chat box, and Mary and I will watch that. And I'll answer them as they come up. Do not wait until the end. You can ask at any time. So as Mary said, this period of history, and I'm going to be completely transparent. I love George Washington. He's my favorite person in history to discuss. Some of my students who are here at the talk tonight can verify that, and they're probably sick of me hearing me say that. But to me, yes, we have Lincoln and we have so many great men and women in our history, but in my mind, none of this happens without the guy we're about to talk about. And just such a fascinating man. Yes, he's got his warts, but relative to his time, he truly is an incredible individual. So these 10 crucial days, as they are called, from basically Christmas Eve and Christmas into of 1776 into early 1777 with the first and second battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton completely turned the war around. If you think about what's happened in 1776, so Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill happens in 1775. And those are, victories, or at least very costly British victories, which really inspire the American public. Washington becomes commander-in-chief shortly after the Battle of Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill. And he's not having been there, his mindset is, hey, we stood toe-to-toe with the British on Bunker Hill, 3 successive charges, inflicted heavy casualties. We can stand toe-to-toe with them. He tries to do it on Long Island earlier in 1776 and comes within a hair of losing the entire war, and then has a reset and says, hey, you know what? This is going to be a long drawn out fight and I have to pick my spots. Washington actually loses more battles than he wins, but his wins are timely. And these 3 that we are going to discuss truly take the revolution off of life support and instill people with confidence. Absolutely turns around the issues that they have with enlistments, which are due to end on January 1st, 1777. So we'll start with another gentleman who I absolutely love to talk about is Thomas Paine. Of course, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. It's a book I'm hoping that we'll be able to discuss for the 250th celebration of our founding here in Delaware County. But the other thing Thomas Paine does is he writes a series of 13 papers called the American Crisis Papers. Symbolic, each one is for a colony. 13 papers, 13 colonies. His first one is arguably his most famous. Washington reads it to his men before they attack Trenton. And it starts, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. This American Crisis #1 appears in the Pennsylvania Journal in December of 1776 on December 19th. So a week before Washington crosses the Delaware. And Paine, I mentioned Common Sense, but the American Crisis Papers also are absolutely available at Haverford Township Free Library. And to this day, a great read. So Paine actually donated his proceeds from Common Sense to the Continental Army because they, Congress, which was a Continental Congress, it wasn't our national Congress, was ineffective, much like our current Congress. That's another discussion for another time. They couldn't raise money. They couldn't feed the troops. They couldn't get them ammunition. They couldn't clothe them. And power was in the governors of the individual states or colonies at the time, and they directed where their troops were going to be sent. So although there's a Continental Army, large portions of them are militia from states. So Washington has to beg Congress for help, but he also has to beg the governors of the various colonies. And of course, some colonies would say, yeah, I'll help, but the help's going to go to my troops and my troops only. So all these things are in the mix as Washington is sitting on the banks of the Delaware in December thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? We are so close to this whole thing being up. So Washington's army, as I had said, had been driven from Long Island. New York City was in British hands. Many of the American troop enlistments, as I mentioned, were going to end on January 1st. After a long, arduous retreat through New Jersey, Winter and the Delaware River keep the British from attacking Washington. Thank goodness. The other thing is there are not a lot of winter battles during the Revolutionary War, much like there really weren't during the Civil War. You know, the fighting season really is when the weather's nice. And when you think about it, the roads are bad, whatever those roads may be, right? They're using waterways and rivers to travel, and if they're frozen, it's hard to travel. So all these things come into play. The Americans arrive on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River on December 2nd. The troops are ferried to Pennsylvania over the next 6 days. British arrive literally within less than a day of Washington's last troops leaving New Jersey, crossing over into Pennsylvania, and the British set up at Trenton. Washington wisely goes up and down the river and gets anything that can bring the British across taken off the board. Any boat, any barge, anything that floats. The British are saying, hey, you know what? We've got these guys on the run. The rebels are on the run. We're pretty cool just chilling out here in Trenton. What the British had done is they fortified 17 towns, if you will, from Delaware all the way up to Staten Island. The most exposed of these garrisons or fortified towns were Burlington, Bordentown, and Trenton, New Jersey. And if you think about it, they're kind of in the middle, right? So more likely to be stronger fortifications down in Delaware or up in Staten Island or further in North Jersey. When you get into the middle of that line is where the British are going to be stretched thin. And this is where Washington is thinking, this is my chance. William Howe is the British commander of forces. The British only hold about 5% of New Jersey. Much of it is left uninhabited by troops, but the parts that are held by the British. Washington needs his army to hold together. He needs to do something big before January 1st, if nothing else, to ensure that his men don't just go home and say, hey, you know what? We gave it a shot. It didn't work out. Washington, by mid-December of 1776, Colonel Johann Rahl is leading the garrison of Trenton. He's the commander of Hessian forces. He is forced to send dispatches to Princeton with a 100-man guard and light artillery. Princeton is about 10 to 12 miles away from Trenton. So he's got a force there. On the 22nd of December, Washington says, okay, we're going to have some sort of an attack here. Reinforcements for the Continental troops are starting to arrive from New England. Some officers advise caution to Washington, saying, hey, you know what? This may not be the greatest thing. Some of the notables at Trenton, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who's Washington's right-hand man, his key aide. James Monroe, who actually gets wounded at Trenton, future president of the United States. John Marshall, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, arguably our greatest Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because of the impact that he had. So you've got a council of war on Christmas Eve, and some of Washington's generals are saying, hey, you know what? This just is not worth it. We should not attack. And Washington says, absolutely not. Trenton is the target. We have a week to do something. They're not going to expect it. So the army would attack Trenton while surrounding it while overpowering the garrison with overwhelming force. And the biggest obstacles, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be the weather and the Delaware River. So one thing that works in Washington's favor is that as the British and really the Hessians work their way through New Jersey, there are constant alarms, 24 hours, 7 days a week, of threats of an attack by the colonists. On the New Jersey side of the river, you have loyalists who are feeding information to Rahl saying, hey, you know what? you better watch out. These guys on the other side are doing stuff. The reinforcements coming down from New England, and Rahl is saying, you know what, we're good. We're okay here. But what these constant alarms do is they tire out the Hessians because they're always running out to address something that's not there. And it also becomes a case of almost like, the boy who cried wolf, right? If you keep saying there's danger, there's danger, there's danger, ultimately, they're going to be ignored. The threats are going to be ignored. So what does Washington do? He divides his forces. He's got 2,000 men who would cross the Delaware south of Trenton to pin the Hessians at Burlington and Bordentown. He does not want them coming up to reinforce Rahl. He has another 800 men crossing directly at Trenton. And then he's got another 2,400 men, and that's who are with Washington. It's the main body of the army. They would cross 9 miles north of Trenton. So it's basically a three-pronged attack, north, right at Trenton, and then south of Trenton. And overall, he's got a little bit more than 5,000 men. So decent sized numbers for this attack. The problem is with the weather, some of the forces aren't able to cross and get over to Trenton. And of course, think about it, no cell phones during this time, right? The communication is shoddy at best. And the other thing, Washington, they're under strict orders of secrecy. So if there's a problem, he's not going to learn about it until he gets to Trenton to see who else is there. The plans, although, and I know I'm not giving up the ending here, although it's a victory, a big victory for Washington, the plans are very sophisticated and count on several moving parts to come together to work. And we'll talk about why it does not. So most of the artillery that Washington has crosses with him north of Trenton. Of course, there's the famous painting by Lutz, and that painting actually of Washington crossing the Delaware doesn't take place or isn't painted for several decades later. Okay, so Lutz isn't there painting as they're crossing. It's based on his perspective and what he's heard. So by the time Washington's 2,400 men and 18 artillery cross, it's 3 a.m. His goal is to be at Trenton at daybreak. And his thought is, it's Christmas night, right? What are the Hessians going to be doing? Celebrating. They're probably going to be sleeping one off. So this is absolutely the best time. Also, the weather's horrible. It's the last thing that they're going to expect. So weather continues to deteriorate as Washington and his men are marching south. Some of his men are without shoes. They're marching, their feet wrapped in rags, and some of the men are leaving bloody footprints. It's a ragtag army. Within 10 miles, or with 10 miles to march, Washington calls another council of war once they get across. And this is just for his northern group. And he says, hey, what do we do? Do we cut bait and go home? Or do we continue on? And the vote was, we made it across, and hopefully that's the most difficult part. Let's march on. So halfway through the march, Washington divides his army again. Half go under General John Sullivan, and they're going to march close to the Delaware, while the main body under General Nathaniel Greene, who is one of Washington's favorite generals, he's a pacifist from Rhode Island who learns about the military by reading books. He leads Washington's Southern strategy and is a big reason why what happens at Yorktown happens. Fascinating man to read about. Greene is going to take the inland route and cut the King's Highway that leads into town, one, so that the Hessians can't retreat, and two, remember, there's that small contingent up in Princeton. He doesn't want them coming down to help the Hessians. So both columns that Washington has split have to arrive at the same time. Sullivan sends a courier warning Washington that the gunpowder is wet. The guns aren't going to fire. Washington says, quote, "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton," unquote. One, nobody talks like that anymore. But two, it shows you Washington is saying it's Trenton or bust. So 2 miles outside of town, amazingly, the force that Washington had split meets up. And they say, okay, here we go. So the morning of the 26th, 50 New Jersey militia attack a Hessian outpost, not knowing about the plan to attack Trenton. They're separate from Washington's forces. So Washington is saying, oh my God, the cat's out of the bag. We're in trouble here. Rahl, who's the leader of the Hessians, mistook it for an impending attack uncovered by British intelligence. And some of that intelligence, remember, is coming from loyalists who are saying, hey, Johann, get on the ball. There are forces coming your way. That 50, he thinks, is the only attack. Of course, you've got Washington's 2,400 bearing down on him. At 8 a.m., Washington leads an assault on a Hessian outpost 1 mile from Trenton. It starts with a fighting withdrawal. So the Continentals are pushing forward and the Hessians are fighting while basically withdrawing or retreating towards Trenton. At 9 a.m., the main attack on Trenton begins. Washington has his 18 artillery pieces deployed on high ground north of town. And for those of you that have been in Trenton, there's King and Queen Streets, and it comes to a V, and that's where Washington has his artillery, because that's the other main thoroughfare out of town. And his thought is, if the Hessians get cold feet, I'm going to blow them away. Okay, so initially the Hessians are able to make a very organized retreat using houses as cover, something that they had denigrated Washington and the Continentals for doing, saying, hey, you're not fighting like men. You're hiding behind houses and fences and things and trees. So the Hessians are outnumbered 2-1. And they basically are giving ground to maintain cohesion and come into a tighter group in town. Washington directs his troops to cut the road to Trenton, which, remember, is the main escape route. Realizing that Washington and the artillery are controlling that V at King and Queen Street with artillery just pouring down on his men, Rahl says, pardon me, that we are going to break the V. And he basically calls for a frontal assault, which is pure murder and suicide. Rahl's plan completely falls apart as U.S. artillery and then musketry start picking off his men. Hessian artillery is completely taken off the board by the American artillery. And what survives of the Hessian artillery is taken by the Americans. So that piece is completely off the board now. So Washington has an overwhelming artillery advantage here. As Rahl and the other regiments start to break and flee east, one of the regiments is under a gentleman by the name of Hessian by the name of Kniphausen. So that regiment separates and they try to cross the Assunpink Creek by a southern bridge. The Second Battle of Trenton is going to take place at this bridge, but not today. So Kniphausen is trying to cross the creek at this bridge. They're cut off by a fast-moving Continental brigade, but not before a small contingent of British cavalry and some Hessians had crossed. Rahl is able to gather his men in open fields in Trenton and orchards east of town. He says, we're going to attack the left flank of the American forces. While Rahl is leading this attack, he is struck in the side and mortally wounded. Washington counters by shifting his line to address the Hessians trying to attack him on his left flank. With US troops basically on three sides and the Assunpink Creek behind them, Rahl and other Hessian regiments surrender. They have no way of escape. Kniphausen and his regiment surrender after failing to cross the bridge. The Hessians lose about 100, 105, 22 killed, 83 wounded. The big number, prisoners, 800 surrender. Also captured are supplies, which the Continentals need desperately, and the Hessian artillery that we talked about. American losses, nobody's killed. There are 5 wounded, one of whom is James Monroe. Washington learns that the other forces that were supposed to cross south of Trenton and directly at Trenton did not make it, fearing that he is now exposed with too few men to attack Princeton or even head up to New Brunswick, where Rutgers is, right? And there's what's the word I want? Rumor that a war chest of gold is at New Brunswick. And of course, the Americans need money like nobody's business. But Washington says, you know what? We're going to recross the Delaware, and we're bringing the supplies, and we're bringing the Hessian POWs. By noon on the 26th, Washington is safely across. In less than 18 hours, he has crossed and recrossed the Delaware and beaten the Hessians at Trenton. Absolutely stunning victory. Questions? Anyone? Comments? As I take a quick sip here. Okay, we will move on. So after Washington's win at Trenton on the 26th, he's saying, oh my gosh, they're going to counterattack. And I'm not sure exactly how we're going to be able to respond here. So the British begin assembling troops below Trenton towards, and really coming from New Brunswick. So they're coming down. And remember, they still have a regiment at Princeton, right? So, Chris, very good question. So Chris's question, after this disaster, how did the British, basically adapt their tactics? One big issue that the British have working against them is pride. They're the best army in the world. They have the best navy in the world. And they really think that the Americans are a bunch of, backwoods farmers. As I said earlier, they think that the Americans fight unfairly by using cover. And the other thing that the Americans do, which is considered very ungentlemanly, is they target officers during conflicts. Washington could have been shot several times during the war. But there's one Scottish soldier who says, I had him in my sights, but I couldn't do it because that's not how we fight. Whereas the Americans said, hey, if we can pick off a colonel or a major or a general, then that force is disorganized. And to your point, Chris, they won't adapt. They won't know what to do. So part of it is the British are using what their playbook, which has been successful for years, and which was successful if you go back to the French and Indian War 20 years earlier, right? 1755 to 1763 in the Ohio River Valley. It helps them to beat the French, to take control of that area. So they're thinking, okay, you know what? Washington got lucky. We're going to be able to bag them up. And one other thing that comes out of the Battle of Long Island, and again, this is, today you would laugh about this, but one thing that the British had done towards the end of the Battle of Long Island, now Washington and his troops escape, but they start playing a fox hunt call. And Washington takes it as an insult. And again, this is why you have to love the Revolutionary War. What we would consider an insult today, back then it's completely different. So they're basically saying, hey, this is nothing but a fox hunt. It's not a real battle. We're going to bag these guys and go home. And that's a problem that the British have throughout the war. They come within inches several times of ending this thing. And many times, and we'll talk about it in the second Battle of Trenton, they say, hey, you know what? We'll get them tomorrow. Well, tomorrow comes, Washington and the troops are gone. So these sorts of things, you think they would learn sooner. But again, having the best army in the world, they're saying, hey, we're running the show here. So thankfully, they did not adapt in time. So Washington wants to build on his momentum, but he's faced with a crisis of enlistments. So on December 30th, Washington crosses the Delaware again, knowing that he's got about 48 hours before many of his guys can leave. And what he wants to do is to draw the British into a fight on ground of his choosing. So to your point, Chris, he's saying, hey, you know what? Howe is going to be ripping, upset. There's another word I'd use, but we're being recorded and I don't want this on for posterity, right, Mary? So he's saying, I'm going to be able to draw Howe in. I'll have the high ground and I'll be able to hit his guys, kind of like a Bunker Hill, Battle of Bunker Hill, right? So Washington is saying, I've got to take another calculated risk, hopefully before the enlistments are up. So Washington and his men cross, and Washington says to his men, if you enlist for 1 month more, we will pay you a $10 bounty. Of course, $10 today gets you, a hoagie and a soda at Wawa. But back then, that's a lot of money. So nobody moves forward. And again, this is what, if I start to weep openly, forgive me, but here's what Washington says to them. Quote, my brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do and more than could be reasonably expected, but your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay only 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. And then he does a mic drop and he steps back and he looks around. Almost every man steps forward and says, hey, we won't give you a month. We'll give you 6 more weeks. So that threat is gone. The enlistment threat, completely gone. So on New Year's Day, 1777, money actually arrives from Congress for Washington to pay the troops. Also, Washington receives what were called a series of resolves from Congress, which increased his powers. During the early part of the war, anytime Washington wanted to do something, and again, we don't have a federal government. This is a Continental Congress, really based on the Articles of Confederation, which gave more power to the states than to Congress itself. Point being, Washington would say, hey, I want to attack in New York, and he'd have to send it to Congress and get their approval. Remember, one of the guys leading Congress, John Hancock, thought he should have been commander-in-chief. So he's not exactly thrilled that Washington beats him out. So there's all of this red tape that Washington has to go through. Imagine today, and yes, there are instances where, operations take place and it comes at the direction of the president, right? Think of the raid to get Osama bin Laden, right? It's President Obama who says, you have the go-ahead, do it. But Washington is saying, hey, I want to do this, I want to do that. And he is not in love with Congress to start, something that's probably carried over to this day. So word reaches General Charles Lord Cornwallis, word reaches Washington that Cornwallis is coming at him. He's marching south with 8,000 men to attack Trenton. Washington says, this is perfect. I'm going to lure them into a trap and make my stand on the bank of the Assunpink Creek. This is the second Battle of Trenton about to take place. Cornwallis is the right-hand man for General William Howe. He had field command of British forces in New Jersey. Howe is wintering in New York City, right? He's saying, hey, you know what? Take care of this, Cornwallis. I'm going to hang out here. So Cornwallis had actually been granted leave to go back to England to see his sick wife, but he said, I have business here to take care of first. So he arrives in Princeton on New Year's Day, and he consolidates his command, brings all the forces together, and he issues orders. On the 2nd, he departs with 5,500 men and 28 cannon towards Trenton. It's already more than Washington's got. It's pretty even, but the British have more. He leaves a reserve brigade at Princeton under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, and he leaves another 1,500 at one of the fortified towns under a Colonel Alexander Leslie. And they're all relatively close. Remember, Princeton, it's about 11 miles from Trenton, okay? So it's not too far, but as we will see, it's far enough. So Washington knows that the British have to use the main highway to come to Trenton. He places a delaying force halfway between Trenton and Princeton under the command of Brigadier General Matthias Alexis Roch de Fermoy. The only problem is de Fermoy is still celebrating New Year's. He's hammered, he's bombed. So command of his force falls to a veteran rifleman, Colonel Edward Hand. Cornwallis deploys light infantry. And what light infantry is, they can move fast. They're not heavily encumbered, so they can strike and move, strike and move. He also has Hessian Jagers as skirmishers in front of his column. As the light troops come into range, Hand's riflemen start picking them off one by one. And it begins a running battle along the Trenton Princeton Road, which is the main road. And this is exactly what Washington wants, because it allows the majority of his forces to get set up in Trenton on Assunpink Creek. Every time that the British would deploy in force, so Chris, this goes to your question about their adapting. The British were big on, basically standing in a line, taking a shot, putting on their bayonet, which was psychologically frightening to militiamen, and then they would charge. And they would also gather their forces together. So they would be very close together and easy to take out. So what happens here is, as the British keep doing this, what you have the Americans doing is they would retreat little by little by little. And they're drawing the British and the Hessians closer and closer to what's behind them, the main force. So they're luring them into Washington's trap. You have the British advance is basically being slowed to a crawl because they're crossing little streams. They're crossing fences. And the other thing that the Americans did is they put all sorts of obstacles in the way to slow them down. So Hand places his men at a place called Shabba-Kunk Creek, which is outside of Trenton, in a strong defensive position. He puts riflemen in trees. So again, very ungentlemanly. Yes, great book, Anthony. Absolutely. Washington's Immortals. So Hand's got guys riflemen up in trees. Despite being outnumbered 6-1, Hand's men put up such a defensive fire that the British thought that they had encountered the entirety of Washington's force. And they deploy into battle lines, which slows them down even more. And they bring their artillery up. It takes Cornwallis 2 hours to dislodge Hand. So maybe we're lucky that de Fermoy was drunk and sent back to Trenton. By about 3 p.m., you've got 2 hours of daylight left, right? We're talking New Year's Day. Sun goes down early. Cornwallis pushes the Americans back to Stockton Hollow, which is a small ravine about a half a mile from the outskirts of Trenton. Washington, hoping to hold the British off until nightfall, rides out to the position and orders, and again, this is why I love Washington. He says, I want you to be, quote, he orders, quote, as obstinate a stand as could be made, unquote. So fighting erupts with Hand's men firing from houses and the British advancing. Artillery is firing from both sides. Hand's men slowly give way, falling back through Trenton towards Assunpink Creek Bridge. And this is, so for you history geeks, think of Burnside's Bridge at Antietam, where you just have a bottleneck and the Confederates are mowed down. Well, so are the Union trying to cross it, and then the Confederates trying to take it back. Same thing happens at Assunpink Creek, and we'll get there in a second. But what this does is Washington has been given enough time to strengthen the south bank of the creek. Hand's men are about to be enveloped as the strength of the British are coming to bear. Washington orders a brigade forward into Trenton as the British and Hessian troops are fighting with the Americans in town. It's a very disorganized fight with pockets here, pockets there. They're not exactly lined up and taking shots at each other, right? So many of the Americans say, hey, we're going to head towards the bridge closer to the Delaware, all right? So Washington, to increase the morale of the troops, stood his horse beside the southern approach to the bridge as his men are falling back with muskets and cannons firing to cover their retreat. Washington stays until all his men are across. Of course, some of his men, Nathaniel Greene, Alexander Hamilton, are biting their fingernails saying, oh my God, the guy's going to be killed. But fortunately, that does not happen here. Assunpink Creek and the bridge were the key to Washington's strategy. A mill next to the bridge actually created a large pond above the bridge, making the creek impassable. With recent weather, the only way across the creek was either the bridge, which the Continentals have completely defended, or a small ford close to the river. The stone bridge was narrow, so think of it. It's like trying to get on the Schuylkill Expressway or the Blue Route, right? For those of you local, or 95, when you get on the on-ramp, you come together, and that's what's happening on the Assunpink Bridge. As the British and Hessians are coming in mass, they then have to shrink it down so that 2 or 3 or 4 across rather than 8 or 10 or 12. And it delays their ability to cross the bridge. So as light is fading away, Cornwallis is saying, what do I do here? Should I storm the bridge, a la Bunker Hill, or do I wait until the next day to attack? The Americans are in strong position. Washington has 40 pieces of artillery on the ridge above the bridge. So anything that comes across that is going to get completely obliterated. Washington is using his artillery. He's got a lot of green troops. The issue that the Continentals encounter during the Revolution many times is they would put the militia up front because the militia were not as well trained as the Continental Army, and they were known to fire around, throw their gun down, and run. So Washington, and the thought was, if I put them up front, they've got a long way to run, and they're going to be running through their own troops who can stop them. So Washington's using the artillery to kind of build the backbone of these green troops. In the U.S. center guarding the bridge are Washington's most veteran troops. Washington asks Colonel Charles Scott, who's leading that regiment, to defend the bridge, quote, to the last extremity. And Scott replies, to the last man, Excellency. So basically Scott's saying, we're gonna live or die right here. This is the hill, technically, that we're dying on. Cornwallis says, hey, you know what? We're attacking, knowing that the Americans could not across the Delaware at night, and that a strong blow may absolutely destroy the American army, as it had done in Long Island, at Fort Washington, at Fort Lee in northern New Jersey. And his hope is this ends the war. So Cornwallis is looking for a weakness in the American position. However, he really can't find any. So the order comes to storm the bridge. Cornwallis says, take it, frontal assault. The Hessian grenadiers storm the bridge. They are supported by 4 cannon. The Hessians make it halfway across the bridge when the Americans start firing both musket and cannon from the opposing bank. Within minutes, 31 Hessians are killed. 29 surrender. So that's the first wave. Next, it's the British Army's turn as a column of infantry starts to form at dusk. Again, you've got 20 American cannons pointing at the bridge, and there are dead Hessians on the bridge. So think of it, and if you're in the second wave and you've got some dead comrades on the bridge, you're probably rethinking your position. However, you have to follow orders, right? So as the British approach, Washington opens fire. The British column is slowed, but they keep pressing forward until they reach the center, when all hell breaks loose on them. The column halts, they break, they retreat. So two forward thrusts have been completely stopped. The British reform on the northern bank and say, hey, third time's the charm, just like Breed's Hill or Bunker Hill. Again, they were met by an absolute storm of bullets and cannonballs. This time, they didn't even make it halfway across the bridge. And think about it, they've got dead piers on the bridge, so they can't make it as far. British reinforcements are called up for another attempt. Washington orders his reserves in and artillery loaded with canister. Canister is basically grape shot. Once it's like buckshot from a shotgun. Once it's shot out of the cannon, it's not a ball, it spreads. So it cuts a swath in front of it, in its path. So what happens here is Washington ends up winning the battle. The British move forward, they break and they run. The British have 365 killed, which is 4 times the number of the first Battle of Trenton. The U.S. loses about 100. So again, stunning victory. The problem for Washington now, it's dark. He doesn't know what to do. He can't cross the Delaware again. So he says, we're trapped between the Delaware and the British. Washington feared that the British would pin his smaller force in place while moving around his forces to basically crush them in a vice. So Washington says, all right, I'm 2 for 2, let's go 3 for 3. As night falls, both armies set up camp. Washington calls another council of war. And think of it, he's called 2 councils of war so far, and as I said, he's 2 for 2. So you would think if you're in this third council of war, almost anything he suggests, you're going to probably ride with it because he's on a hot streak. But Washington says, we can stay on the south bank of the creek and let the British wear themselves down trying to storm the bridge the following day, or we can withdraw to safety. Washington says, you've got that British garrison at Maidenhead and at Princeton. They're going to start coming this way. They're going to know what happened, and we still have this large force in front of us. So what do we do here? He says, and this, going back to what I said earlier, very rarely do you have a night battle or even a night march. Of course, Washington didn't have one on Christmas night. They have a night march on the 2nd. And where do they go? They head towards Princeton. And what Washington does to keep up the appearance of his army remaining across from the British at Assunpink Creek is he leaves several men behind to stoke campfires, make noise like they're digging and all these sorts of things. And imagine if you're one of the lucky ones who gets to stay behind to create this, false impression while the entire British army is across the creek or across the way from you. I would be saying my Hail Marys for sure. So Washington is thinking, if we surprise the British again at Princeton, there's no way that they are expecting us, then we're in good stead here. So his one thing is he's got to stay ahead of Cornwallis and the main force. He needs a head start. So while the men are working in the camp to make it look like the entire American force is there, Washington takes the rest of the army. He doesn't go up the main road that the British had come down from Trenton and fought Hand's division in a retreating fashion towards Trenton. He takes back roads to Trenton, okay? Different cow paths, if you will. The plan is similar to Trenton: surround the town, cut the roadways to prevent escape, and destroy the garrison and capture supplies. Speed was absolutely essential. The US forces would outnumber the British by 5-1 at Princeton, because remember, it's a smaller force. And the British have 8 cannon at Princeton. Washington's bringing 35. So the numbers are on his side. By 2 a.m., the Americans are on the move. And think of this, you fought all day, right? And you've had some pretty emotional battles over the last 5 or 6 days. Now you're doing a 2 a.m. march towards Princeton, towards you're not sure exactly what you're going to run up against. So they march along what is called the Quaker Road, and they take an unused farm lane, Sawmill Road, and they approach Princeton from the south. American intelligence provided Washington with a map of Princeton's defenses. So he has a good idea of what's coming. Guarding Princeton, you've got about 1,200 men, okay? So again, Washington outnumbers them by about 5-1. Washington arrives at the intersection of Sawmill and Quaker Roads and does just what he did at Princeton, or at the First Battle of Trenton. He divides his forces. A smaller force continues up the Quaker Road and takes a small bridge over Stony Brook, which is extremely important. It's located at the intersection with Kings Highway, which is the main highway. If possible, a detachment would return to cut the roads north of town. Leading Washington's main body is our good buddy, Nathaniel Greene. The troops performed well at Trenton and would lead the attack. Behind, and these are veteran troops, Washington's best men. Behind them are the Philadelphia Associators, great name, under Brigadier General John Cadwalader. They are green. They have not heard a shot fired in anger, except for what they heard over the past week. The entire force would continue down Sawmill Road to Princeton. At daybreak, they're going past farms of the Clark brothers, who see them, and unfortunately, the Clark brothers are loyalists. So they tell the British, hey, you know what? You got trouble coming your way. As Washington's men are approaching, they see 2 British horsemen on a hill, and then they see a force rise up, and they say, oh, brother, here we go again. So the battle turns into a classic engagement where basically you have 2 battles, and it really comes down to split-second decisions that decide the Battle of Princeton. Washington doesn't know that he's only facing a small portion of the British garrison. His flank and his rear are threatened. Washington decided he would screen the main body of his force as it continued into town and delay the British as much as possible. Mawhood sees the threat and says, let's go after him. Mawhood detaches his regiments, and he's saying, what we need is to come across and go at the flanks here. Not knowing he was facing most of the British brigade, Washington sends Brigadier General Hugh Mercer's brigade across the Clark Farms, supported by 2 cannons. Mercer's 300 men were a great screening force, and they're made up of riflemen. They advance towards a ridge and orchard near one of the Clark farms. They take position along a fence on the edge of the orchard and wait. And again, very ungentlemanly, sitting behind a fence. Just for time's sake, we probably got about 5 to 10 minutes, and we can open it up for questions, okay? So Mercer's screening maneuver turns into a pitched engagement. As Mercer enters the orchard, a volley from the far side comes at him, and British troopers start coming across the field in a skirmish line. Their volley actually goes high above the Americans. The Americans respond and start picking off the dragoons. And remember, the one thing I said, they purposely shot upper leadership first because they thought men without leaders will be completely disorganized. Same thing happens here. As they start picking off dragoons, the British fall back. Hearing the first exchange of volleys, Mawhood has his men drop their packs and basically dress in line for battle. Okay, so he's ready for what's coming at him here. Advancing quickly, the British slam headlong into Mercer's men on the orchard's edge. Both sides are shooting each other. Once again, the initial British volley goes high, and the Americans' response is much more accurate and deadly. But the advantage soon edges to the British because of the green troops that the Americans have. The American riflemen don't have bayonets. And remember, I said, and it may sound silly today when you think about it, you know, I might be much more fearful of somebody shooting at me than if somebody fixes a bayonet and is coming at me. But in those days of warfare, a frontal charge with a bayonet is a terrifying thing coming at you. So the Americans are shooting back at the British, but their rifles are not as good as the British muskets. So they're shooting slower, and the British are able to advance across the valley. And ultimately, Mawhood says, let's charge them with the bayonet. Across the valley, the other American force is dressing their ranks around the other Clark farm. What happens is that Nathaniel Greene knows that Mercer is going to need help, and he says to Cadwalader, go forward with 4 cannon. The British bayonet charge breaks the first American force, who run for the hills back to the Clark house. Mercer tries to gather his men together. His horse is shot from under him. Mercer is ordered to surrender, tells the British to go jump in Assunpink Creek. And what they do is they basically draw their swords and bayonet him 7 times. He dies 9 days later. As Mercer's men are fleeing the orchard, they pass through Cadwalader's forming lines, which are more veteran. And it confuses Cadwalader's men, who say, hey, maybe we should get the heck out of here too. So the British have an advantage here. Like other previous battles, Americans' morale is low as the British are pushing forward with the bayonet and starting to shatter the American lines. Mawhood pushes his men across the fields. In his mind, he's thinking, if I can cut Washington's column, then the battle and maybe the war are over, despite what happened in Trenton over the past week. So Washington says, I need a little bit of time. What comes to the rescue are some of Cadwalader's men. Cadwalader places a battery on the shoulder of the ridge and fires down on the British. Washington personally takes command, riding among the men. And again, other Continental leaders are saying, oh my Lord, the guy's gonna get killed. Remember, Washington is big for the day. He's about 6'1", 6'2". So in those days, and that's a big man today, but in those days, even more so. So as the firing is going on and Washington is leading his men, he comes to within 30 yards of the British, giving the order to halt and fire. The British fire at the same time. And as the smoke clears, the Continental Army breathes a sigh of relief because Washington is still sitting on his horse. So Washington's aide de camp says to him, you have to come back. If you die, this whole thing's over. You know, guys aren't going to fight. So when the firing stops, the British actually retreat, which makes no sense because they have the advantage here. So more American troops then start to fill the field. In the center, you have more artillery coming into play. So American lines are starting to envelop the British. And some of the British retreat, others flee along that Stony Brook Bridge. Others say, hey, you know what? Let's head towards Princeton. So what happens here now is that after about an hour, the battle is over. Washington, so the British basically snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by retreating early and ending the fight. Washington, and this, he takes heat later in the war for not going face to face with the British. And as I said earlier, losing more battles than he actually wins. But here, Washington is able to break British regulars by adapting on the field quickly. Unlike Trenton, the victory, it wasn't as total as Trenton was, but it was still a key victory. A number of British soldiers are captured. The British lose about 230 men with another 250 captured. American losses total 80. The Americans held Princeton. So, and the other thing is, as they come towards Princeton, you know, legend has it that the Americans under Hamilton fire a cannon into one of the buildings in Princeton and hits a portrait of King George right in the center. I think that's got a little poetic license, but you know what? It makes a great story. So the Americans hold Princeton until the afternoon. Cornwallis, finding Washington had gone across from him at Assunpink and hearing the guns fired in the distance, set out towards Princeton. Washington is in no condition to fight, nor is his army. So he withdraws and heads towards Kingston, New Jersey. At Kingston, they move north to Morristown, which is central Jersey. The British disengage and they head back to New Brunswick, which Washington had toyed attacking because of the British war chest and supplies. But he said, you know what, we can't do this. So the British, after these 10 days, withdraw most of their forces from New Jersey, guarding the garrison at New York City. With over these 10 crucial days, the Americans crossed the Delaware 3 times, fought 3 different battles, beating the British at every turn. When the Americans arrived in Morristown on the 5th of January, the war had changed dramatically, and people who had more or less lost faith in the revolution, you now have a groundswell of support. And think about it, this is early 1777. We're still 4.5 years from Yorktown. So we still have a ways to go. But that is where I'm going to end. I am first, and again, thank you everybody for your attention, for attending. I am happy to answer any questions whatsoever.
Questions, and you can put them in the chat too.
Hey, Jim, this is John.
Yes, John Milius.
Another great talk. Love this.
Thank you.
One of my favorite, obviously, battles of the Revolution. It's almost epic. Do you think this is the 10 most aggressive days? I mean, obviously, the march to Yorktown was bold. They had to pull a lot of things off to make that work. But I mean, don't you think that he wasn't always this aggressive? Most of the time, he's more defensive. So this was would you mark this as the most aggressive 10 days that he he had in the whole war.
I would for Washington. Now we can talk about Saratoga, but Washington's not there, right? Which is also aggressive.
Oh, that's right.
So and Clyde, yes, the Army spent the winter in Morristown, which was as bad as Valley Forge. And in some cases worse because of the lack of supplies. But yeah, John, as I said earlier, Washington, there are attempted coups because, and especially after Saratoga, pardon me, Saratoga, because they think that Washington is not aggressive enough. So there's talk of replacing him, which goes by the wayside after what happens in South Carolina with the Southern strategy. And the beauty of Washington is he knows he's got to pick his spots to go at the British. And think of, even in modern warfare, and not to go down this rabbit hole, but think of like a Vietnam, or think of what happened in Iraq, where, we show up with overwhelming force, but we're fighting irregular forces who say, hey, if we keep them here long enough and bleed them out and make them spend money and all these other things, ultimately they're going to say this just isn't worth it. So this 10 days, I feel, it's Washington at his most aggressive. Remember, a year earlier, he tries it in New York and it almost gets his head handed to him. Now, later in 1777, he's going to try to be somewhat aggressive as well at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, loses, and then much like the British snatched defeat from the jaws of victory here at Princeton, Washington does it at the Battle of Germantown in Philadelphia proper. They've got the British on their heels, but Washington's plans are so convoluted and so difficult that the British end up winning that battle. And that really, almost for the rest of the war until the French come in, Washington says, hey, you know what? If we can string these guys out and bleed them and make them work hard and these sorts of things, Nathaniel Greene is completely outnumbered in the South, but what he does is he drags Cornwallis all over hell and creation to the point where their lines are extended and Cornwallis says, I got to catch my breath. And then what Greene does and what, Francis Marion does and Daniel Morgan is they take their opportunities to take shots at the British and they're well timed. So this to me, and so this is my opinion, which with $1 will get you coffee at Wawa. I think these 10 days are 10 of the most important days in our country's history. You have the Normandy invasion, right? June 6, 1944. You have July 3rd, 1863, with Gettysburg and Vicksburg falling. This is right up there for me because, of course, if Washington loses this, guys aren't going to re-enlist, and quite frankly, the war's probably over.
Jim, I'm not a military historian, so I'm going to ask kind of probably people would say this is a really dumb question, but
no dumb questions.
So my husband, his family is from Springfield, New Jersey, and of course the story there is about the battle where they are blockaded in a Presbyterian church, and they run out of wadding paper.
Right.
So the phrase is "give them Watts."
Right.
Watts was the hymn writer.
Right.
So they were literally, tearing the hymnals to use it for wadding paper. I'm just not sure how that lies with what you've just talked about with these 10 days. I know, I mean, it's in New Jersey, but when was it?
Right.
How does it relate?
So that I don't know. The other really big battle in New Jersey, which works well for the Americans, is the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, which takes place the following year. So it's after Washington and his troops spend a winter at Valley Forge, which is, brutal, like Morristown is. Of course, Valley Forge gets all the ink. Morristown was just as ugly. But what happens at Valley Forge is Baron von Steuben comes in under the guise of being this great Prussian general. He was Prussian, he wasn't a general. But he basically trains the troops how to drill, how to fight. And the British say at Monmouth Courthouse, they say this is a different fighting force than we faced the previous year. They're not running, they're drilling, they're doing things properly. And to go back to Chris's earlier question, this is where the British say, hey, you know what? We may have to adapt, because a year or two ago, we would fire a round or two, the militia run, and we put a bayonet on and charge. But now that they are more well-trained, we have to stand toe-to-toe with them. Now, the Americans also use that against the British in the South, where, Daniel Morgan puts his greenish troops up front at Kings Mountain, knowing that the British are going to fire and they're going to retreat. He has his best troops hiding over a hill so that when the British start chasing the militia over that hill, his guys are picking them off one by one as they come forward. And the British say, oh my gosh, we've been taken by surprise here. So yeah, no, I'm going to look that up, Mayor. I would not be surprised that that's true, because you hear so many stories of, because supplies were so limited, they had to, do all sorts of things to improvise, right? They didn't have what the British had. And it's not until the French come along, and yeah, the Dutch are helping us, and the Spanish a bit with money and loans. And, the French aren't helping us because they want to see us establish a republic. They're helping us because they want the British to get kicked in the teeth. But still, it's not until the French come on board where those sorts of issues are, they decrease a bit. They're still there because of just the inconsistency of the support that Congress was able to garner from the governors of the various colonies.
So my husband heard my question and said it was 1781.
Okay, no, still, I'm going to look it up because I'd not heard that.
Yeah, well, it's just local lore from,
Oh, sure.
From growing up in the town.
Right. No, that's great. I love it.
Give them Watts.
Yep.
Other questions for Jim? There was some interesting comments in the chat here, Jim. The British never learned. Same thing happened in 1781 at Cowpens. The Brits persisted in frontal assaults. Multiple delaying actions by Washington allowed the Continentals to encircle the British and defeat them.
Right. Absolutely. No, completely agree. There's a great book. I think it's also by O'Donnell. It's called The Men That Lost America. It's by an Irish author, and it may not be O'Donnell, but I actually got it at the library, and it talks about different military commanders. Of course, the King of England. It talks about Lord North and Lord Dartmouth and how they all played a role, and the Howes, as I mentioned, in losing the war. What I found fascinating is before the war started, many of them wanted conciliation with the colonies, but the king said, absolutely not. We have to go and crush Boston. And that's really what opens up this whole can of worms. O'Shaughnessy, thank you, Chris. I knew it was an Irishman. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, great book.
Tell us the title one more time.
The Men Who Lost America. Really good read. And it's from the British perspective. So it's, it's not quite the romanticized version that, I love to talk about. We've all learned, and, hey, we won. So what's the saying? The victors write the history. So
right. At least from our perspective.
That's right. That's right.
Other questions, comments? Wow, that's a lot. So really, and it's
I know, and I appreciate everyone. It's hard. So I've taught courses on this, like 5 weeks, 10 hours. It's hard to boil it down to an hour.
Right.
And I hope I didn't bury you in too many details. And it's hard without maps, but I truly appreciate everyone hopping on and your interest, and really hope that you enjoyed it. I love talking about this stuff. I hope you could tell.
Awesome. Well, just a reminder, I did record this, and so I am going to send it out to the group if you wanted to re-listen to it, re-watch it. I will send that out probably tomorrow. And if you've got people in your life that you think would enjoy this talk, send it along. It will be on our YouTube channel. And that's a great place to check out. Jim's got other programs there. He did a program about, was it April 1865?
Yes.
That we did last
Yes.
spring. And we also recorded Jim's talk at Nider Hall from this summer about the way Philadelphia celebrated the bicentennial. So, and I said that I think there's going to be more programs that are going to celebrate our 250th anniversary. So, and Jim is involved with that. So stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely. And Mayor, one quick shameless plug.
Yeah.
So I give talks like this pretty frequently, local libraries and civic